We're running in the 80s this time, with Night Driver on Atari Archive. These days, nearly every racing game published is designed around the player's viewpoint being either behind the car or in the driver's seat itself. While Night Driver did not originate this perspective, as we'll see shortly, it without question popularized it both in arcades and in Atari's home conversion. Yes, Night Driver is a return to the realm of first-party arcade conversions for Atari, something not seen since March 1979's Canyon Bomber and Skydiver ports. The VCS version is based off of the October 1976 arcade game of the same name, then nearly 4 years old by this point. But the technical marvel that was arcade Night Driver in its fast-paced, first-person perspective is no less impressive on the scaled-down VCS port, as a machine designed to play versions of Tank and Pong is once again pushed to new ground. But that same arcade game has something of a sordid history, as Atari and two of its arcade competitors practically lifted it wholesale from a German arcade game, Nürburgring 1. Nürburgring 1 was developed and more or less released in 1975 by Dr. Rainier Forst, who had developed it not for a game, but as a driving simulation, using the TTL technology found in Pong cabinets at the time. Forst was interested in early driving simulators, but was frustrated at the expense, as they were built around computers either putting the image through a projector or on an oscilloscope. After Pong became a hit, Forst recognized that he could make a cost-effective coin-op version incorporating the circuit board and monitor arrangement from arcade machines. The cabinet included all the things you'd expect from a driving sim. A wheel, pedals, a shifter, a speedometer, a mileage gauge. Crashes would be counted and the player would get hit with a timer penalty. The game would end if players either finished the course or when the timer ran out. Forst had 2 cabinets finished in 1975 and had them on the show floor of the International Exhibition for Coin-Op Games in West Berlin the following March. There was interest in what he designed, but since Forst didn't have the money to fund production beyond 1 unit a week, other companies decided to copy what he was doing rather than wait on his glacial pace. One of the first companies to do so was Digital Games, known shortly after as Micronetics. Digital Games was a small player in the arcade realm. One of their engineers, Ted Michon, had been sent to West Germany to fix a defective shipment of the company's game Air Combat when he happened across a Nürburgring 1 machine. By chance, at the same time, Forst was there giving a demonstration to his kids. Michon was able to learn how the machine worked, and when he returned to the US, he was able to develop a version of the game of his own. Given Micronetics' weak position in the market, its owners decided to license the game to Midway, and after some re-engineering by developer Jamie Fenton at Dave Nutting Associates, the game was now running on a microprocessor-based machine that allowed the white rectangles that indicated the sides of the road to scroll smoothly and quickly. Midway initially showed it off as Midnight Racer at the Amusement and Music Operators Association show in October 1976, before renaming and shipping their version as 280 Zap, after the Datsun 280Z car. The company had licensed the vehicle for promotion and decided to use the namesake for their game as well. Micronetics would publish their own version, Night Racer, at the end of the year, but closed down soon after. At Atari, developer Dave Shepard says he was given a piece of paper with a photo of the Nürburgring 1 cabinet, including the picture on the screen. He adds that he never saw the game in action or had any idea how it was designed to be played, but was aware that it was a German game in origin. According to historian Marty Goldberg, Atari had actually licensed out a version from Micronetics' unlicensed Night Racer, and had just provided Shepard with a minimal amount of information to do their own take. This became Night Driver, a game that had the steering wheel, pedals, and gear shift of its German predecessor, along 3 different tracks players could choose from. The biggest difference was inside the cabinet, however. Where Nürburgring 1 used 28 circuit boards, Atari's Night Driver had only 1 with a microprocessor at its heart. This made it much easier and more cost-effective to produce, and Atari ended up selling approximately 2,100 cabinets. The hardware engineers had designed a board where 16 sprites could be placed anywhere on the screen, and Shepard said these were used for the rectangles that represented reflectors on the side of the road. Observing how fence posts, lamps, and signs move while he drove on his commute, Shepard attempted to simulate the same motion for these little rectangles on screen. These rectangles were all the processor and circuitry needed to deal with, too, Instead of drawing a car graphic on screen, Atari simply placed a decal on the screen of your vehicle's hood. According to Shepard, this was an extremely popular game within the company, with a steady stream of people coming through Shepard's lab to see it in action. Something he said was a distraction that cost him development time. This all undercut Forst, who back when Michon met him, was working on getting his game officially licensed in the US for production. Though the 28 circuit board setup was making things difficult, and once Midway and Atari had undercut him, he saw many of his orders cancelled. Michon would write him a letter explaining what had happened with his game stateside, and Trakas, the company that initially produced Nürburgring 1, even sued Atari over their clone. Forst, undeterred, would found his own company and continued to work on follow-ups to his initial game, including one called Nürburgring Power Slide that had an early example of physical feedback to the game. The player's cockpit area would tilt back and forth based on what was happening on screen. And Nürburgring Competition, which had fully linked up cabinets. Overall, however, while 280 Zap, Night Racer, and Nürburgring 1 were all fairly obscure minor footnotes in arcade history, Night Driver has retained some recognition over the years. A big part of that may be due to its solid home conversion on the VCS, which was by mid-1980 rapidly growing a relatively sizable consumer base off the strength of Space Invaders. The VCS actually hadn't seen any kind of racing game since its 1977 launch, when it came out alongside Indy 500 and Street Racer. Both of these games were unique takes on the racing premise, and similarly, Night Driver is just as different. This was developer Rob Fulop's first game on the VCS, having started off doing sound effects for Atari's Superman pinball machine as a summer job, before being hired on for the home division after graduating college the following year. In interviews, Fulop said he'd started programming in high school, writing simple basic games like a NIM clone called Takeaway, and a boy analyzer that would write out how good a boyfriend someone with a specific name would be. After coming to the home division, he was given a bare-bones manual for how the VCS worked and unfettered access to Atari's arcade demo room. Fulop explained that, when starting out, he felt like he couldn't necessarily make a video game, and as such, all of Fulop's games written at Atari would be conversions of existing titles. After 6 weeks, he decided he could get a version of Night Driver working on the home console, and with a lesson on getting the display working from Larry Kaplan, Fulop got underway. Owing to the differences in hardware, he made several changes, arguably for the better. As the game used paddle controllers, the gear shift had to be removed entirely. The car now accelerates quickly to its top speed, which can be adjusted by flipping the right difficulty switch. If you've got your system set up appropriately, one could even use that difficulty switch as a de facto gear shift. The road is more crowded now too, with other cars showing up that you must dodge. The left difficulty switch adjusts whether or not you get a heads-up honk as they approach. The game also features little embellishments not seen in the arcade game, such as houses and trees alongside the road. Despite these changes, the base premise is still largely the same. A player has a set amount of time to travel as far as they can on one of 3 set courses, or on a randomly generated course. Each collision will immediately halt your car and force you to get moving again, in turn costing you points. And much like the arcade game, the display is incredibly stark. Besides the cars and houses, about the only visual cue on screen are the reflector lights along the edge of the road. Courses can be tackled without a timer in some game variations. Effectively, these are practice modes that allow the player to get familiar with the courses and the game itself. While it lacks the gear-shifting complexity of the arcade game, this home version of Night Driver is a solid title. It's fast, the driving action is smooth, and the paddle works perfectly as the steering wheel. There's a learning curve on taking turns, and sometimes the other cars will pop up at inopportune times to avoid a collision, but on the whole, this is a fine take on Shepard's original. Prior to Night Driver, the only VCS game to use the same perspective, more or less, is the 1977 release Starship. Comparing the two allows one to really see an advancement of visual fidelity in VCS development. Bob Whitehead's game has simple, one-color sprites that grow in size as one approaches them. Night Driver has the same size changes as the driver moves along the road, but the cars and houses have significantly more detail to them than Starship's alien craft. There's a lot of flicker, but with the speed of the game and the short periods of time anything other than your car is in one spot, it's not that big a deal. Fulop said that near the end of development, folks from marketing came over to check out the game he had written. Fulop said that one of the marketing executives asked him where he had gotten the idea for the game, seemingly not realizing that they'd already done an arcade original by the same name. The shipped game includes a minor bug that causes the screen to blank out if the player turns all the way left, and then does a hard right turn all the way on certain parts of the track, something Fulop remarked only seems to bother him. Bally Midway would bring a home version of their 280 Zap arcade game to the Bally Professional Arcade as well. This version plays much more closely to its arcade namesake and the arcade version of Night Driver. While it still doesn't have gear shifting, the paddle knob on the controller allows for fine driving adjustments, much like its VCS cousin. The road has no obstacles or embellishments like Fulop's title does, and you really realize how much they add to the game when you see a take without them. 280 Zap also only has the one track, which limits how much there is to do in it. To compensate, the cartridge does include a second game, Dodge 'em, that has you dodging other cars to reach a finish line. This is similar to Atari's Street Racer or RCA's Freeway game on the Studio 2. In fairness, though, 280 Zap did come out in 1978, 2 years before the VCS Night Driver, and there literally was nothing on home consoles like its main attraction at the time. And both Night Driver and 280 Zap were thought of rather highly at the time, and even for a few years after. In the Arcade Alley column from the January 1981 Video magazine, Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz raved about Night Driver. They referred to the game's use of simple white lines to define the road as ingenious, and gush about the additions Fulop added to the game. Arcade racing game fans, they write, will be glued to this one. They revisit the game in the pages of Electronic Games magazine from July 1982 in the midst of a roundup of racing games, noting that both Night Driver and 280 Zap have excellent graphics and are true driving games due to their perspectives. Creative Computing also had a cursory review of Atari's game in their September 1981 issue, saying only that it is a home version of the popular arcade game, and that some people love it and others hate it. Thankfully, this is one VCS game where you can suss out some internal sales figures early on in its life, thanks to a screen grab of an internal net sales sheet from the Once Upon Atari documentary that was owned by the late Jerome Domerat. While portions of the document are cut off, it suggests that Night Driver was Atari's 5th best-selling title up to an unknown year, bested by Pac-Man, Space Invaders, Defender, and Ms. Pac-Man. Night Driver sold over 161,000 units in its first year, with another 779,000 in 1981, 457,000 in 1982, nearly 581,000 in 1983, and while it's cut off a bit, it looks like around 5,000 were sold in 1984. Given that no post-1984 releases appear on the visible pages, it's likely that this document doesn't include any of the new games released in the Atari Corporation years, and likely cuts off either at 1984 or 1985. With our usual late 80s internal sales figures, we can continue this sales trail along with 84 copies in 1986, just over 7,200 copies in 1987, and over 4,400 copies in 1988. Not counting any sales from 1985, which are still unaccounted for, and assuming the 1984 net sales were in the positives, the game sold about 1,996,268 copies in all, which is frankly impressive for a conversion of such a minimalist arcade game. With Fulop's Night Driver proving that these first-person or behind-the-vehicle perspective racing games work pretty well in the VCS, a few more would appear in the years to come, including Atari's Pole Position conversion, Activision's Enduro, and Coleco's unreleased Turbo. Night Driver set a fresh standard for VCS driving games, and proved that rookies can still take first place. Next time, we learn about the dangers of physics.